We have Stephanie Allen and Sam's here as well. Steph, thanks for coming on. Can you give us a little intro on yourself?
It was just weird hearing my full name, actually.
Well, you always call me Christopher, so I
I
thought
know,
I'd
that's
just
true.
be.
That's true. No, thank you guys. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, it's been a little bit of a transition year, but I was in Boston, at Boston PT for, gosh, 7 years. And Zach and I just moved to upstate New York near Rochester in February. I am doing fully or full time remote work with ACL Resolve, and we're both kind of cruising and trying to grow Calu. So that's kind of where we're at right now. I don't know if you wanted me to go way back, but that's a longer story because I've been out like 10 years now. So it's like, it would be the extended version.
Maybe you dive a little bit into the intrigue for specializing in ACL and the decision to go with ACL Resolve, that background maybe, and then we'll go into the primary topic.
Yeah, sure. I feel like the choice was interesting. It was eventually a choice, right? And I always had an interest in ACL rehab after my injury and going into PT school because mine was my senior year in high school. But you guys know from being in school too, there's so much packed into those years that thinking about specializing while in school and right after really wasn't on my mind. It was just kind of something that I would get excited about if it was on my schedule or read about in free time if I had a choice. And then after school, I stayed in Ithaca and did a residency, and then I did travel PT for a couple of years. And I've spoken about this before, but the Spark Notes version is kind of like while doing travel PT was really where I feel like I started to divert more towards wanting to actually build a caseload that was ACL rehab. Because I remember thinking that it didn't seem to matter where I was in the United States or like across state lines, that pretty much everywhere the standard of care for this particular post op situation was not great, if I'm putting it nicely. And I felt like, even at that time when I hadn't dove in super deep, that even with the little bit that I knew, including obviously the advantage I had with having experienced it myself, that it wouldn't take that much more to just do like a little bit better. So when I landed in Boston and I wasn't traveling anymore. So I was ready to kind of like build expertise, have a local impact if I could, as far as people, wanting to come to Boston PT and come to me for this kind of thing, and kind of raise that bar, at least for the local people that were coming to see us. So by that time, it was just really like a probably borderline obsession. um, and I continued to see, even with the relationships that we made or didn't make with docs in the area. There's so many universities and hospitals in the Boston area, and Boston Children's is huge. So it was a really good place to be in that sense. So I think it just all started to make sense. And then developing relationships with some of the local sports teams and schools there was really helpful as far as for me getting experience, um, and confidence, so that when other life stuff happened and potentially having the option to start something of my own as a solution to some of the things that I was struggling with in clinic. I think that all, again, this was over the course of a decade, right? So this isn't like it wasn't something I owe. I didn't graduate school and ever want to own my own thing. It was not, that wasn't the original plan. But it just all kind of made sense, I guess. And I think the continued reminder from what I was seeing in clinic as far as how far we have to go with this particular rehab was, still, I think, reaffirms, and solidifies that this is where I belong.
Thanks for that background.
Yeah.
So now you're only seeing ACL patients, and a lot of your education on your Instagram is ACL driven. So there was a post you had talking about why limb symmetry index is not enough. So that's primarily going to be the topic for today, and the more general topic of quadriceps testing and the extensor, mechanism testing. So maybe we start with, why is testing the quad important and necessary in this particular population?
Kind of feel like I need to have like Laura, Derek, and Eric in here along with me. Um, but yeah, so one of the ways I explain it to people too is take the injury itself and then on top of it, how we surgically repair it. So the injury itself, what we know now is one of the first things that happens is your body shuts down the quads because you need the quads to do most things in your daily life that are standing, including stairs and walking and all that kind of thing. So one of the ways that your body protects you from loading your knee that now it knows does not have your ACL, because it gets a lot of feedback from your ACL, is that's what happens. It shuts down your quad and you can't walk normally and it hurts and all those kinds of things. So that's kind of the first insult aside from the trauma of the injury itself. And then when we go into surgically repair it, you are now adding another piece of trauma to the injury in the joint and the ACL, which your body also knows. And part of that surgery is often a nerve block. So whether we can differentiate this either way, but in some way, shape, or form for pain control, they're anesthetizing some of the muscles that basically part of the quads if they're using a femoral nerve block, or ideally they're going more now with an adductor or in your groin block so that the knee joint isn't super painful after surgery. So that's technically like insult number 2. And then number 3, depending on what graft you have, if you are younger / more active, you're pretty much going to be guaranteed to get a quad or a patellar graft, which is cutting into and taking out either some of your actual quad muscle and tendon or part of that whole extensor mechanism with the patellar graft. So for me, that's sometimes, and I know it's a little bit of a stepwise way to explain it, but sometimes people are like, why do they get so weak and so fast? Like, how does it get so small? And it's like, because your body's super smart. And so it's going to respond quickly this way, but it is a kind of multi-step thing. And that in and of itself is one of the reasons why it takes so long, not only just to get those quad muscles back to the strength that they were before, but ideally you need to get it stronger and the other side stronger than you were before your injury. So if you take a look at that timeline, it's like, okay, this is the main muscle group that's going to make the difference in your knee functioning normally and putting you at lower risk as much as we can do that, for all the things that you're going to need to do for sport. So that's why we need to work on it so much. And the only way we can tell if it is strong enough, however we determine that, which I know we'll get to, whatever strong enough is to measure it. And there's no way that we can measure it objectively without numbers. So it's kind of like how I would normally explain it. The other side also is that there's a lot of research to corroborate that the quad strength has a lot of correlations to either good or bad outcomes, depending on what those numbers are.
So testing it, there's a variety of ways. What is the worst way to test it? And then we can talk about kind of the gold standard and then everything in between.
Did you put that question in here on purpose? Just to kind of like piss me off a little bit? No, I'm
I just
kidding.
think people need to hear.
Yeah. So yes, this is a good PSA, Chris. Thank you. If the only way you are being tested is by your PT or the doctor having you kick into their hand as hard as you can, or pull back with your hamstrings, that is not the way to test. That would be the current worst way to test, unless we're talking about not testing. That would be the only thing worse.
And then is there a gold standard for actually in the research? What do they normally utilize to test?
I'm pretty sure, unless there's something super new out, that isokinetic testing is still gold standard, at least for strength. We could talk definitely, or definitely have people refer to Laura's episode as far as some of those other things like force plates. But yeah, that definitely gives us the most granular info and more than just the LSI, which I know you referred to before. I would also argue that some of the reports that I look at, there's still a bunch of things that I don't even consider. There's probably like 3 or 4 main things. So there's still some noise, but that the isokinetic, the big fancy machine, is gold standard.
So if isokinetic is going to be used, what are the parameters that the machine should be set at?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I've learned this. This has been an interesting piece since starting to go remote with my clients, because one of the big things that I've been searching for slash compiling a list of is providers around the country that actually know of or can provide isokinetic testing, because it's unfortunately not super easy to access. So different places have kind of like protocols that they use as far as what they do, settings, they like speed of the machine itself. So for those listening who don't know, like the isokinetic machine, you're kicking into a fixed speed, basically in the extension bar, and then pulling back against a fixed speed, and it measures what you can do force wise through that whole range. Most often, I would say, or the settings that I think I'm most familiar with getting information from is 60 degrees per second. They usually will set the machine to be either a little past or right around 90 degrees of flexion, but not all the way up to 180. Sometimes people can't get there, and or it's a little uncomfortable, and their strength at that point is really in that range is not going to be strong. So it's kind of like could potentially just throw off data anyway. I forget what Laura uses. She might go, I forget now. We have to ask her, but they will set the range, they'll set the speed, and then it's usually the protocol is usually 5 reps, and they may do up to 3 trials. I like when they do a few trials, especially if it's the person's first time, because the test itself is, you need it to be explained. You basically need to learn the test. It's not a super intuitive thing like a knee extension exercise. It's a little weird at first. So oftentimes I'll ask if they don't already provide several trials for people of those 5 reps. I'll ask that too, because I think that that's definitely helpful, even especially if it's the first time. But any one test in and of itself isn't going to tell us a ton. That's why you need to have it done repeatedly or serially.
So the majority of the conversation is going to be more so about like the interpretation of the test results, less so like the setup of it. But can you, because there is limited access to the gold standard, can you provide just some brief examples or options of ways to set up this type of testing for a clinician that doesn't have an isokinetic machine on hand?
Yeah, I would say for majority of high school or leisure athletes, and actually, to be honest, I don't love saying athlete, because I feel like most people that are in a situation where they tore their ACL, like they're pretty active individuals. They're all kind of athletes to me, so everybody gets tested the same. But regardless, for most individuals with this injury, even just isometric testing, which is basically instead of your leg moving through the whole range, it is in one fixed position, usually 60 or 90 degrees of knee flexion or knee bend. And you're just kicking out or pulling back as far as hamstrings go, as hard as you can for about 5 seconds. And that just, there's different ways to measure how hard you're kicking out. And so therefore that gives us the raw numbers that we can do some calculations with and get some of the pretty similar information to isokinetic, just maybe not as granular. And so I actually did, I have to look back at it now, and I'm sure the prices have changed because this was like a year ago. but I actually did a basically like an audit of what it would cost with a crane scale to get the things that you would need for your clinic. Because I had some people reach out and say like I can't get my boss to get a Tyndek or a an actual dynamometer that might be closer to like $800 or $1,000. And so I was like, well, let me just actually do some research. So for what we could set up, I think the crane scale itself might be between 30 and $50. That might even be on the high end. And then you would need a chain, an ankle strap, a couple of carabiners. And ideally, if your clinic doesn't already have a plyo box that's like hollow underneath, that's the ideal. You could probably use a treatment table, but it might not be sturdy enough. And that's literally it. And when I tallied it all up, I think it was like $120 or something like that. So even if right now it's like 200, I would feel like most clinic owners could afford that. It's just a matter of justifying it. So yeah, the setup I'm talking about is what we would call inline, where the person is sitting, the ankle strap is on their ankle, their hips are ideally fixated down. We in the clinic used to use the mobilization belt for that. So sometimes you already have stuff in the clinic you can use, which is great. And then the chain fixated behind, either right at 90 degrees to a shin that's straight down, or a little bit lower if you're going to go at 60 degrees. And then whatever device you're using, the crane scale, Tyndek, or dynamometer, is basically with the carabiners hooked onto. It's like foot, carabiner, force measuring device, carabiner, chain. And then that way you can measure them kicking out. I'm not sure if I verbalized, if the verbalized version is painting a good picture, but it's an easy setup.
Yeah, it's somewhat hard to describe unless you've seen it. I'll have to attach. Steph, I don't know if I know you. Kevin works with you now, but have you seen a picture of our makeshift setup in the clinic? The Rogue box he like created a prototype for.
I don't know, but now I'm gonna have to ask him.
So I'll take a picture of it, but maybe I'll
Yeah.
link it in the show notes. It's like a Rogue plyo box. It's the wooden one,
Mm-hmm.
and then he created this design where you sit on it, and then your knee crease goes on this slope, so it automatically sets like your knee angle to 60 degrees, and then he put a rod at the bottom of the box, so you can strap around whatever strap you want, and then there's like two holes, so if someone's below 6 feet, we kind of set it there or under, and it pretty much just it immediately sets them up to like a pretty automatic knee angle that we would hope for, and then they can grab the sides of that Rogue like plyo box, and it gets the job done. And it was relatively cheap setup to make, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just this compact little sitting option. So he got creative with it. Maybe I can share it for people who want a more elaborate setup, but all your options are great as well.
Yeah, Kev would do that.
He would, yeah. So, okay, you got the test set up. You do a test. Let's go into interpreting what the information is and why it's valuable. So, let's initially define what limb symmetry index is first.
Yes. So in this case, we usually do it for quads and hamstrings. Oftentimes, if you have the time and the setup, you could do it for calves and hips. But that's probably a different podcast because that setup's interesting. Or get Jason on for that one. But essentially, it is a measure of your injury side as a percentage of the non-injured side. So the raw numbers give us, let's say for quad output, somebody kicks out, an average of 3 to 5 trials, whatever, to minimize fatigue. They kick out 80 pounds on their surgery side and 120 pounds on their non-surgery side. Then you would divide 80 by 120 and get their percentage of right to left quad, not strength, force.
And there have been these, I don't know if the word's norms, but kind of cutoffs or minimums of starting activities with this number, this limb symmetry index, like running, return to play, etc. Can you briefly elaborate on what those are and some of the typical values?
Yes, I think a lot of what comes up is the LSI at which somebody can run, because that's usually it's what everybody wants to do first, usually. And I would argue that's an important thing to be able to do, even if it's not a main part of your sport. And so that, interestingly enough, seems to vary. I think that I take a little bit more of the approach that Eric Meda does, in the sense of, for a long time, I think I saw a lot of at least 80% LSI, where I started asking questions in the sense that I had some people who were generally strong before their injury. And so if they're training as they should, meaning they're challenging both the non-injured leg and their injured leg, sometimes that non-injured leg shoots up so quick that it's going to be a long time before they're at 80%. And for inline running, if certain other things are looking good and their torque to body weight ratio is above a certain point, then the LSI is a little lower on the totem pole as far as for starting straight line running, like no cutting or jump and land, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, let's go into some of these limitations of just utilizing limb symmetry index and establishing criteria for progressions with just that information.
Is that what you're asking me?
That is what I'm asking. Yeah, why is it just utilizing this
Steph, go
potentially
here. Okay,
limiting?
got it. um, it can be, I hate to sound sensational because that's not really my nature, but it can be dangerous if the only thing that we're looking at is the limb symmetry index, because on the opposite end of the spectrum of maybe that person that I just mentioned that was generally strong before, and so maybe their LSI is like 70, but torque is looking good on both sides. I know we'll chat about that, but um, some of their early plyos, skipping, marching, load tolerance, all those things are looking good. And the running itself doesn't look terrible, because the other thing that probably isn't for today is, like, sometimes people on paper, all the numbers look great and they run and it just doesn't feel good and it doesn't look good. So that's not a test. It's just like they're not ready yet. So that's just like a side note. But I actually had somebody, when you reached out to me and I knew we were going to be talking about this, it made me think of a conversation that I had with another clinician, reached out to me on Instagram, like, I don't know, a year or so ago. And she was asking some of these similar questions. And so I asked about the strength data. And this clinician had already started doing like run walk progressions and whatnot. And so I had her say, okay, or I had her look at the moment arm. So the distance from knee to ankle strap. And I showed her how to do a torque calculation. And it was not anywhere close to high enough. And so again, like, she was really, I should say, not close to being high enough to feel safe for somebody to run, especially when we know that the torque to body weight ratio is being taken into consideration for something like running, which those forces are considerably more than body weight. So maybe that helps clarify a little bit. She was really open to it and had a conversation with the patient, and they changed some things and then worked back up to it. But I remember that sticking out to me as like, if, like, even having the testing, great. Like, I love that people are going for that and asking their employers and just setting stuff up or buying Tindex themselves and setting it up in the clinic. But that's where I feel like this piece of the conversation is really important, because you can do a very easy calculation with the data that you get from the isometric testing. If you know their body weight and you know the moment arm, that can help inform decisions even more than just looking at what percentage of force the injury leg is outputting versus the non-injury leg. So I don't know if that fully clarifies or answers.
That does. And maybe just a summary would be if they have a 90 or 100% LSI, but they're drastically lower than the forces necessary for specific tasks, or it's lower than their body weight. Say they're kicking out 100 pounds bilaterally. Well, that's 100% LSI, but they weigh 200. That's not ideal. So
Yeah.
let's go into the peak torque to body weight ratio. What does that mean? And then the specifics of how we would calculate it and actually set it up.
Yes. So torque, good old physics. I wish that I appreciated physics a lot more in school than I did, because we use it every day. But so if anybody in school is listening to this too, like, seriously pay attention. But torque is rotational force. So when we're talking about the knee, it's basically that force that rotates around the knee. And the sole muscle group that does that, or the main muscle group, is the quadriceps. So when we are looking at torque, like knee extension torque, that is why it is so much a good estimate of how the quads are doing. Torque is the force, or that number output, times the radius of the circle around which the knee it is creating. So therefore, the radius is the shin length, essentially. In this case, if you're doing isometric, let's say, that's why I was talking about the distance between, I was telling that clinician to measure between lateral knee joint line and the middle of the ankle strap that she used, because that's therefore the radius of the circle. And then we can get with the force, the radius of the circle, and the person's body weight, their torque with the radius and the force relative to their body weight. So you don't need the isokinetic machine to do that. Obviously, it's a little bit more of an estimate, but you can take average of several trials to do that. So that's the difference between torque and just the force output as far as that first piece. That's the first part you were asking, right? Okay.
Yep.
And then there seems to be, and this is definitely could be a whole nother conversation. An isokinetic machine will oftentimes give force in foot-pounds, at least in the US. A lot of the research and data out there is in Newton meters per kilogram. So again, you could just take some of the pounds. I would measure the moment arm in centimeters, because that's always going to be meters. And then you could do the same calculation. The sort of cutoff or goal that seems to be mentioned more frequently in the research is 3 Newton meters per kilogram. And that, if you do the math to correlate it, it's like around body weight. Like, you want to be able to kick out body weight if you were to look at if you were to break it down to like the raw numbers. So it isn't that 3 Newton meters per kilogram isn't like everybody needs to get to that to be able to play. And it also, I'm pretty sure, again, unless there's newer stuff I haven't read yet, has been more so that that number has correlated with better outcomes, not necessarily lower re-injury rates. So that's where I also like to clarify with people, like, this is a good measure of us knowing you're strong enough. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are now at lower risk because you've already had the injury. I think already having the injury already puts you at kind of a different level of risk. So, and again, that's not to scare people. Like, people that get to somewhere around 3 seem to have pretty good outcomes. They also tend to be people who are maybe a little more psychologically ready, are, in a fitness, and strength training routine, and will continue to be and have all those kinds of good habits and support too. So no, it was a little bit of a diversion, but those are kind of the numbers that we originally shoot for. But I think where there's some nuance, and you guys can probably speak to this too, with just measuring enough people and seeing enough athletes and clients and patients, but sometimes the person's other leg will kind of level out at like 2.5, 2.7 newton meters per kilogram. And if you know that that person's been training really hard for a year and maybe that's their ceiling, that's something that I've talked with Eric about too, Eric and Laura, just like, will I not return somebody to sport if they don't get to 3? Like, no, there's other things we look at too, if that makes sense.
So that 3 you said earlier, that's a rough estimate would be relatively close to their body weight. Is that right?
Yeah. I can corroborate that somewhere. I think it's that might have been a conversation I had with Laura too, because when I was first really learning the parameters and what they mean, because again, I wanted to make sure that the conversations that I was having with people were correct expectation wise. And that's kind of where the assertion or like just reminder that it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a significantly lower risk. You have a really good shot of having good outcomes. And if you keep with these good habits and have reached these numbers, I feel like we can say we've done all we can do. That was part of that kind of learning curve. But yeah, I believe because she has the isokinetic machine in her clinic. And one of the ways she was explaining it to people too is like, if you do the, I don't know, I guess math, then it works out to being able to kick out 100% of your body weight when you're looking at foot pounds. So that helps people, I think, visually and from like a raw number standpoint, have a goal, which is also not necessarily a bad thing when we're talking about motivation because of how long and up and down this rehab can be. And if anybody's competitive going through it, it's kind of nice to have a goal. And that's another reason why the repeat testing is huge, because you can just make sure that with your programming, with whatever your plan is, that you're going in the right direction.
Why can't we just use their body weight as a target? Like taking out their body weight, if that's roughly 3 newton meters per kilogram.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you can. I think the bigger piece, the next piece becomes how quickly are they doing it, which isokinetic shows us. There are, I think, peak force systems can show rate a little bit, but this is more of the impulse talk because basically impulse is force over time, and so force over time curve you get from an isokinetic machine will show you that graph. So ideally, you want the slope of that graph to be really high. Basically, you want to get to your peak as fast as you can. And some of that is the thought behind that is just because of how quickly an ACL injury occurs, particularly non-contact. So if you're able to generate high forces pretty quickly, then the thought is you may be better able to, on a field or court or in a contact situation, even have the strength and the reactability, I guess if that's a word, to get yourself in and out of maybe positions that may not be ideal for the ACL itself.
I think that there's definitely value there, but even in the general concept of returning back to a sport, you need to be able to have a sufficient rate just to be able to participate, not be at a risk of secondary injuries other than the ACL. Is there a goal rate that people should be aiming for?
That's a really good question. I think it's nearly impossible to get to peak in the amount of time that an ACL injury would happen. So I agree with you, Sam, and that more of that talk closer to sport is probably more on the performance side. But again, indirectly, that's likely going to impact positively your injury risk going back as well. I have played around with, when we're doing isometric testing, only doing so normally like we're cueing people and you're yelling at them or not yelling at them, like the same every time, like repeatable test as far as the encouragement level kind of thing. And usually it's around a 4 to 5 second ramp up, right, to their peak. So as people get closer to sport, I will only give them about 2 seconds and see what they get to, and see if we can build in that range as well. Obviously, when the programming should reflect that too, as far as like what they're working on speed wise in the gym as well. But I actually don't know. I don't know if you guys know of any that are kind of like a cutoff specifically for that. I think that kind of begs the question, or maybe opens up the conversation to like RSI, like reactive strength index, somebody's like springiness essentially, because I think it's harder to, I don't know if we have like an impulse target.
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Just maybe looking at the other
I know
side
there is some
too.
data on RSI for return. We discussed that with Laura when she was on. And yeah, something that you can measure with like the force plates. I don't think that's usually something that you look at with a isokinetic or a isometric test.
Yeah, I think I would say that in that case, I would compare side to side, and not even necessarily have like a, oh, I want it to be 90 or above, but I think it would just be more like more information. Like, is that increasing? Is that getting a little bit closer together? But I've also had, full transparency, I haven't had regular access to an isokinetic machine. I read a lot of them. But other than Laura's clinic and the occasional, we only had isometric in the clinic, and I'm remote right now. So I'm used to reading the data, less so on like being there and looking at it, which is something I hope to do in the future. So
Going back to peak torque, that's in combination with limb symmetry index. I'm assuming you're still utilizing both and having both guide decision making. Is
yeah,
that fair to say?
yeah, and I think the what maybe goes without saying, but humans are complicated too. So like, yeah, those are super helpful numbers to be able to help have the conversation with the person, the client or patient, and explain maybe why certain things in the program are what they are, or why we're not doing this yet, or why we're going to do this for another month and then recheck. So it helps there. But there's situations, there's always outliers, right? Like there's some people I've worked with who are a year plus out and they dealt with a lot of muscle inhibition or something, and their numbers are kind of borderline, but everything else, like they've been doing plyos for, you know, 6+ months and tolerating that. And really all they want to do is run. And if the numbers aren't quite there, but things are looking good and they're not having pain, we can have a conversation about doing some run walk intervals to like mentally build them up, because it's oftentimes at that point they're just so fed up with being rehabbing their knee, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Is there a paradigm of tests and scores that you work through in aspirations of progressions? Like, for instance, like limb symmetry index, or generally quad score matters here. And once you hit that, then I care about blank test and then blank test as your progression moves on towards return to whatever sport it may be.
Yeah, so we try to be um everybody's slightly different, but yes, for the most part. So like first and foremost, after those initial stages of like if we get somebody early, um all the basics of range of motion, get swelling down, get the quad woken up, normal walking, that kind of stuff. It really is like, okay, then we just go into strength building mode. And once they hit, let's say they get 3 or above on both sides by whatever, 8 or 9 months, something like that. Then there may have been some of this stuff happening in the background in their programming anyway, in regards to trying to build up RSI or rate of force development, for lack of better terms, as far as like a quality. But ideally, if they don't have access to isokinetic or force plates, because that has been a challenge virtually, is not every place has both. Oftentimes the most we can get is isokinetic. So some of the information that you're mentioning kind of almost solely has to be off of that. Plus, when we start to do controlled, not full percentage effort, acceleration, deceleration, change of direction, some of it is kind of observable, qualitative. But ideally, if we have a way of measuring their RSI, whether it's a clinician that can maybe use my jump or something like that, or has force plates and can go see someone like Laura who knows how to do either a drop jump or those repeated single leg jumps like she was talking about, that would all be great in my opinion as far as making some more closer to sport decisions. But I would say that actually, so we have like basically criteria and like general non-timeline based phases that after each one are like in order for us to kind of progress to the next phase of programming or modified sport participation. If we're looking at closer to the end, there's kind of like, if we had access to all testing, these would be ideal. And on the virtual side, to be honest, usually we can get like 2 or 3 of those. But those end up being like, okay, full range of motion, no swelling, LSI above 80, let's say for running and modified sport participation, or at least being able to go into a sprint progression program, let's say, before going into sport participation. Isokinetic above 2 Newton meters per kilogram to start running. Just trying to like think of that list in my mind. Oftentimes for virtual, we're also doing kind of like 3RM for knee extension, hamstring curl. Those don't outweigh something like an isometric or isokinetic. But sometimes in between testing, we'll do that because depending on how accessible it is for them, it might not be able to be done every 4 to 8 weeks, which would kind of be ideal. I know, I think Laura does it monthly with her clients. So I kind of insert some of those in the interim because oftentimes people aren't going, at least my client roster aren't going like every 8 weeks. It might be every 12. It might be a little bit longer depending on what it's costing them out of pocket too. So those are things I have to figure out too. But yeah, we generally have an ideal. And then if I'm being honest with how things are set up now, sometimes it has to be what they have access to. But honestly, it's the biggest thing that's like a non-negotiable for me is just that there won't be nothing. We're gonna be measuring something.
So do you work towards, after those initial stages like you mentioned, so LSIs 80%, full range, etc., do you start doing any hop testing? Do you start doing any single leg drop vertical jumps? Do you do 5-0, 5 drill, any of those ones?
Yeah, so later on, yeah, thank you for bringing me back. The later stage ones, we do so what I'll do, depending on what level they are, is, so I'm similar to Laura in that I kept finding that the single leg drop vertical jump is, even some of the individuals that move super well or super coordinated, like it's a hard thing. I feel like it takes a lot of skill. So sometimes it's not always the best measure for me qualitatively because both sides don't look awesome. I know I cannot do one on my surgery side. And I'm not sure if I ever had real like ups like that. And you'll come across people that do. You probably do, Sam. But that one's tougher for me, and I think it's even a little tougher virtually to really fully assess. So I will try a double leg drop vertical jump and look at it from front to side. But then I do have a sort of template built out that will modify based on what they have access to or where they're at. That involves like some sprint increases to look at that qualitatively. Then, and we would have done these already, but as far as the like assessment day goes, that would be in their program. Then some higher percentage speed, like full decelerations. like with each foot forward, and then 45-degree cut, 60-degree cut, 90-degree cut, which basically I'm looking at those just at the cutting point from a couple different angles, and then working up to that. Usually we'll do like a T drill and then working up to a 505. We will time them and look at the difference there, but I would say that most of these I'm looking at qualitatively, and then also checking in with the client and being like, how did it actually feel? Because a lot of times they just know, they're like, I just couldn't push off fast on that side, and you can usually see in the video. So numbers wise, for something like a 505 or a T drill is nice because you can actually see, okay, when I pushed off my surgery side, it was a second or two longer, and I could feel that. And when I pushed off the other side, it was a lot quicker. And from a sport perspective, kind of brings us back to like what we were talking about before. That particular piece is probably a little bit more on the performance side, but knowing that it was mostly because it took them longer to push off, and maybe in the video, they didn't bend their knee very much. They had a pretty stiff knee when they're changing direction 180 degrees. That's more of, that's not just performance. That's not only going to slow you down, but it's potentially putting you at risk.
Yeah, definitely. And like having observed a lot of 505 drills, like you'll see people rotate their leg out too, so that way they can de-emphasize it. Because if it maintains like a forward pointing towards you as the viewer, so that they have to maintain like a sideways or perpendicular position to the cone, they have to actually plant and cut harder, versus if they rotate their leg out, then they can get away with not having to push off as aggressively.
Yeah.
So then it decreases the duration of time that they have to plant, or increase the duration, because if they kept their foot, they'd have to land sharper. So I think it's a great drill overall, both from a
Yeah.
quantitative and qualitative standpoint.
It's been
But I do
interesting.
agree with you on like the single leg vertical drop one is pretty awkward. But I have people do a 5 hop and a 10 hop test and just hop in place, and I try to measure the time and the time and height, so duration of time that they're on the ground, height that they achieve. And I used to use my jump app before. Now I have force plates, so I'm able to look at a lot with it. But yeah, I find that one super insightful, because up until people are in a really good place, you can see a lot of data from it.
Yeah, that's
Sam,
what I was
are
going to say.
you
It is interesting. You see a lot more than you think. Again, not that our eyes are the most reliable, and that's why the numbers that coincide with are important. But I definitely resonate with what Laura was saying too about it's helpful from a learning perspective for the clinician or the coach too. That if you look at the numbers and then you look at the sprint or the hop or whatever it is, and it or the 505, and it matches up with what the numbers say. Like let's say after their isometric test on the isokinetic machine, an impulse was a concern, and then you try and again, it won't be 100% because from a risk standpoint, but like a 70% speed, like 90-degree or 180-degree cut drill, and you see that, or even just the hop test you were saying, like you can see they don't get off the ground as fast. You don't necessarily need horse plates to be able to corroborate that. But that's so much more useful, I think, when you have the numbers and they potentially match up. Or if they don't, then like, okay, let's go to the drawing board and figure out what's actually going on.
what else, Steph, do you feel like we didn't chat about with these maybe bigger picture testing, looking at a variety of tests, guiding decision making? Maybe because I still think the peak torque can be just confusing to understand how to utilize it and then like how to calculate it. Do you have any advice for patients, or not patients, for clinicians on, I know Scott Morrison has that app that kind of estimates probabilities of this is kind of where it's at. Is that what you primarily utilize, or for people trying to implement this, where would you recommend?
Yeah, I would 100% use Scott's app. Then you don't need to actually do the math. You just need to know the numbers. And again, I think it's important to know where it's coming from. And if you wanted to do it, like there were some times in the beginning, no offense, Scott, I'm just a little OCD, that I would do the math too and just like make sure, like I trusted him. Don't get me wrong. But I think that's also a helpful exercise to be like, okay, like I Googled what, how to pounds to newtons and put it all in and did, newtons times the meters divided by the body weight and, that kind of thing. So you can do that for sure. But there's tools now that make your life so much easier. And I think as long as a lot of what we talked about, as long as you are interpreting it well, and therefore making decisions with, or having those pieces inform your decisions that you're making with people, that's the bigger piece, because there's always going to be tech and numbers and all that stuff's just going to keep evolving. And I think it can be scary, but I think I definitely take a similar approach to Eric and Laura, where it's like, they're like, if you've ever read, and Sam, you see it all the time, I'm sure, there are so many variables that the force plates give us. And I want to say that, like, depending on the person, there might be 2 to maybe 5 that matter. For 5 might even be a lot that matter for that person. So I think as far as like what I would say to people starting to just first try this stuff out is literally like, try it on yourself, try it your coworkers, just play around with it for a while first, and really keep it low pressure, because it's just going to give you information. It's not like, oh, I have to do this right the first time. I have to say that for the isometric setup, when we first got the dynamometer, we got a dynamometer, like the bigger one, a Mark 10, before we got the Tyndek. And it was at least 6 months, maybe closer to a year, before we ended up on the setup that like I've shown on Instagram. And there was definitely some numbers that weren't accurate. We almost broke our wooden plinth because somebody was too strong. Like, why would I think that a wooden plinth would be okay for somebody that can kick out like a lot of weight? So I hope that makes people feel better too. But kind of like just continuing to refine and take the information in, but don't necessarily judge yourself or the setup for it. Just like continue to work with it.
Have you had any clinician that said they've broken a plinth while testing?
You have?
No, have you?
Oh, no, but I've come
Like
pretty
snapped it?
close. I'm
Have you,
sure
Sam?
maybe somebody listening to this will be like, yes, I have. I know. You never know.
I haven't heard that, but I am confident I could have. Yeah, I've always set it up to have the anchor point attached to something that's like a sturdy metal object. Like in my facility, I have my wall mounted rig. Then I put a table that I can, like a folding table, and then I anchor people to that table so that their back is towards the pole. And then I use a strapping system to anchor my inline pole dynamometer to the rig itself, and then attach onto their ankle. And so then the table is flush against, they kick as hard as they want, they're strapped to the table is against, but like they're actually pulling against the rig. And in other facilities, I've done like the box setup, like Steph said, and always attach it to a squat rack or something that's anchored to the floor, because I have seen some huge scores. Like when I was in San Diego working with a bunch of NFL guys, like there was, yeah, huge numbers that could have very well broken a wooden plinth.
Yeah.
And I have no desire to be a part of that.
Yep. Yeah.
Say, any other final thoughts, either of y'all, before we wrap it up?
I don't think so. I think that the more people in clinics we can have, starting with even just the less expensive stuff and just experimenting, like, just remember you're doing better than not having it. So the more we can get that and have people out there asking questions, that makes me a happy human.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Steph.
Thank you, guys.